Hello, everyone. Welcome to Conservation and Management of Amphibians and Reptiles of the Southwestern United States. This is the final in a 5-part series of webinars. My name is Jen Williams. I'm the National Federal Coordinator for Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. I have Sarah Sparhawk with me. She is the Visual Information Specialist for the National Park Service, and she's assisting with the logistics of the webinar. So I just wanted to extend a special thank you to Sarah. I'm going to go over some logistical items before we start the webinar. If you're interested in asking questions, please type them into the questions box on your control panel. So again, you want to use the questions box and not the chat box. The reason we have you enter the information into the questions box is that we can export everything that was entered into there after the webinar, and it will then contain all of the questions asked as well as the contact information of whoever asked the questions. And then having this information for the future will help us to better tailor content for future webinars. If questions keep coming up, we'll know that we need to hit that particular topic better. So we are recording today. This webinar will be posted on the park website at parkplace.org. That's P-A-R-C place.org. And if you click Habitat at the top of the page and then select Webinar, you will find the page where the recording will be housed, and you will see recordings from past webinars in this series as well. So a little bit about the speakers. Larry Jones is a retired biologist who spent over 40 years working for federal, state, and local natural resource agencies. Ken Halama serves as director of the Mott Rim Rock Reserve and Emerson Oaks Reserve for the University of California Natural Reserve System at UC Riverside. Rob Lovich is a senior natural resource specialist for the U.S. Navy in San Diego, California, and Rob manages projects throughout the Southwest. More information about their degrees and other expertise can be found in the webinar announcement. And so just a reminder to the speakers to be on mute unless it's your turn to talk. And so we'll start off with Larry, and take it away, Larry.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Next slide. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, about this webinar. So some of you may not know what PARC actually is. It's Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. And then in particular, I want to talk a little bit about the Southwest region. Then after that, Ken is going to get into some basic information on reptiles and amphibian natural history, because let's face it, people don't tend to know as much about reptiles and amphibians as they do birds and mammals, even if they're biologists. So we're trying to give people a little jump start there. Also, we want to give them a jump start on our Southwest Habitat Management Guidelines. This is the main reason we're meeting today. And what we're trying to do is focus on some of the animals and their habitats and how to manage them when we're trying to manage for many other different taxes. And also hopefully give some people ideas for management options of what to do. And so really we're trying to help you get started using that Southwest HMG, and I hope everybody has one. If not, I'm sure you can contact Jen or go onto the park website to find out. Next slide. So the committee here would like to thank the U.S. Forest Service for some financial aid in doing this. And on my final year or so of the Forest Service, when I was working for the Forest Service, they actually funded me to work on the Southwest Habitat Management Guide so we could get it wrapped up. Thanks. Next. Okay, as I mentioned, even biologists are more familiar with birds and mammals and probably fishes than they are a number of amphibians and reptiles. And unfortunately, what this means is a lot of people are kind of unaware of amphibians and reptiles and what their ecological roles are, how important they are. And when I talk about my slides, these photographs, I'll tell you what they are. This one in the upper left, this beautiful little snake is called a Sonoran shovelnose snake. It looks a lot like a Sonoran coral snake, but this is essentially a non-venomous animal. And a lot of amphibians and reptiles, especially snakes, are often maligned. And I came upon this western diamondback rattlesnake when I was looking for snakes one night that had its head smashed and its rattle cut off. And whoever did this probably thought they're doing society a favor by getting rid of this, but make no mistake, these things have important ecological roles, and this snake probably would have eaten a lot of rodents in its lifetime. So hopefully you'll have a little awe and wonder about these animals when we're done here. Next. So what is PARC? It stands for Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. And really it's nothing you have to be a member of. It's an umbrella organization that if you want to be part of it, all you have to do is come to an annual meeting or look at the website or work with others, your other partners. And so it's a very diverse group. And when we have our annual meetings, once a year, we have them in a different state. You'll see that there are federal agencies involved, such as the Forest Service, APHIS, BLM, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service. There's always good representation from state wildlife agencies. So we tend to have all herpetologists from all of our states, or at least most of the states, at these annual meetings. But there are others that are involved, such as non-government organizations, academia, lots of universities, even high schools, zoos, professional societies. Environmental consultants are really big now. There's a lot of biologists make their living with environmental consultants, and there's lots to do. And then there's just plain old individuals who are managers of the landscapes themselves, and they can all be part of PARC. Next. So the way PARC is organized, it's essentially United States and northwestern Canada have PARC regions. And there's two ways to look at these PARC regions. One is by the member states. I say member because these borders are drawn around the state lines. And then there are also biogeographic boundaries. So if you look at this, you'll see there's 5 PARC regions. There are a number of state chapters. And in the Southwest, that's a big yellow blob there you can see. A very large area. And that includes the states of Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, and Utah. But if you look at that yellow blob, you also see that to the north, if you're, say, in Northern California, you actually have an environment that is more like the Northwest than you do like the Southwest. And the same with Texas. If you look to eastern Texas, it's much more ecologically aligned with the Southeast PARC region. So you need to consider both of these when you're reading the HMG. Next. So PARC's mission is pretty much what its name is. It's forging proactive partnerships to conserve amphibians, reptiles, and the places they live. So it's about conserving amphibians and reptiles and their habitats. And one of the ways that the PARC does this is through publications. So I'll get into some of the publications we have in a little bit. This next slide, the next thing, the training, the slide shows a training program that was done for the flat-tailed horn lizard. This is sponsored by PARC. And then we also have our annual meetings. I mentioned those. This year it's going to be in Oklahoma. And then we have annual reports that's done at the national level. Then we have websites. So all of the national and regional and state chapters all have their own websites. Just Google those to find those. We also have a few webinars, and you can even have projects where you get partners together to work on various things, such as a wetland project. Next. So talking about some of the publications, I think one of the most powerful things we can do is give something to our end users to look at to help them know how to manage for amphibians and reptiles, how to conserve them. So on the left, you'll see the Inventory and Monitoring Handbook. That's been out a couple of years. I don't actually know its availability. And admittedly, this is a little lean on the southwestern area, mostly because a lot of the people who wrote this were in the east, but it's still one of many tools that can be used. So what we've done is we have a southwest region Habitat Management Guidelines. We call that the HMG. So you can see on the right, that's the HMG that we have with the Gila monster on the front. And in the middle, we talk about regional priority species and parkas. So this Southwest Park came up with a list of reptiles and amphibians, and sometimes groups of those that we are concerned about as far as their conservation. And parkas, if you're familiar with the important bird areas, this is just the amphibian and reptile counterpart. And this is, the parkas are in the works, but the regional priority species are actually in Appendix E of the Habitat Management Guidelines. Next. So there are 5 regions in park, and each one has its own Habitat Management Guidelines, or the HMGs. And you can see the one on the right, it's enlarged, bigger than the other ones, but that's because it's better. That's because we put it together. So actually, it is physically larger, not length and width, but depth, because it has more pages, because there are quite a few more entries in the Southwest. And you'll see why that is in a minute. Also notice that the other HMGs all have amphibians on the front. And the Southwest region was the first one to put put a reptile on the front. And that's partly because the Southwest is really known for its reptiles, more so than most other regions, although there are a lot in the Southeast also. Next slide. So talking about the diversity of amphibians and reptiles across the different regions, you can see the Southwest on the far left and going over to the Northwest region. So those are the 5 regions. The blue bar is the total number of amphibians and reptiles in the region as indicated by state boundaries. And then reptiles in the red, so you can see there's a lot more reptiles in the Southwest than there are elsewhere in the other regions. And amphibians, we actually have more species of amphibians in the Southwest than we do in other regions. A part of this is an artifact of the fact that all of Texas is included as a Southwest state, because the Southeast also has many species of amphibians, and the Eastern United States in general. The actual total number, this is an older slide, so the actual total number that we have in the HMG is 436 total amphibians and reptiles in the Southwest. Next. So this is just showing you how we stack up with other regions. And you wouldn't expect many frogs and toads in a place that's as arid as the arid Southwest, but there are actually 76 species, which is really surprisingly high. We're not the highest, but it's quite high. For example, we have a lot of frogs and toads that are explosive breeders that come when the monsoon arrives. The salamanders, this is kind of surprising also. We have about as many as the Southeast, which has the most species. And it's mostly because California and Texas each have a lot of species of salamanders. Turtles, we lose out to the Eastern United States, although there are many in, also many in Texas. And Texas is a big state, so we have a lot of animals there. The lizards, this region is by far the best region for lizards. We have 111 species, which is over 90% of all of the species found in the U.S., so most of them are here. Snakes, we have even more species of snakes, which is more than any other region, 127 species. And we even have one crocodilian, again in East Texas and Oklahoma. And that's not many, but it's 50% of all species in the United States. So that comes out with 436. Again, it's the most diverse region based on the nose counts in one of the matrices and one of the appendix in the Southwest HMG. Next. So there's a diversity of habitats. This really starts the explanation of why we have so many species. So I'm going to go through these pictures going from the upper left, going clockwise, and then I'll end up in the middle, just so you know what these are showing. So we have desert habitats such as White Sands National Monument, the upper left. To the right, we have plains grasslands and wetlands. This is in Colorado, I believe. Then we also have high mountains. The Sierras and the Rocky Mountains are very high, and there's actually animals living up there, timberline in some of these places. Some very sensitive animals up at these elevations. We have lots of forests and woodlands. It's not all desert out here. And if you think of California to Texas, we have oceanfront on both California and in the Gulf of Mexico. And there are animals that live at this interface as well. So this diversity of habitats, next, means that we have a diversity of species. And this just shows a snapshot of the 436 species. And the upper left, that's a Gilbert skink. That's a breeding male, very beautiful animal. Right of that is the Sonoran desert toad. This is a toad that's almost as big as your head. And below that is the yellow mud turtle. It's one of the actual southwest turtles we have. Far lower left, that's a Mojave rattlesnake. You may know that because of its notoriously venomous nature. And in the center, one of the many types of salamanders that you have in Texas and Oklahoma are some of these troglodytes that live in caves, and they're blind and have gills throughout their body. So this is these blind cave salamanders, really interesting animals. Next. And so you have all these species and all these different habitats, and now you have to figure out how to manage for all these things. So that's where it's really a challenge, and that's where the Southwest HMG comes in. So just an example of some of these management options and challenges. Again, starting upper left, prescribed burns. Most of our ecosystems here are fire adapted. This is a grassland that's being managed with fire. To the upper right, you'll see this is biologist swabbing for chytridiomycosis. It's a devastating disease of amphibians in the Southwest and beyond. Cattle grazing is one of the biggest uses of public lands and private lands in the Southwest. And in the lower left shows the one part of the existing border fence along the border of Mexico. So this is something that's exclusive in the Southwest, is having this border with Mexico and issues that go along with that. In the center, we have lots of open spaces in the West and the Southwest, and this is good areas for wind and solar energy, but we also have coal mining, uranium mining, and other uses such as that. So lots of challenges. Next. Now I'll hand it over to Ken.
Okay, thanks, Larry. What we'd like to go over in the next series of slides is a little bit about the natural history of the reptiles and amphibians and some of the aspects of their biology that you need to consider when you're developing some sort of management plan. And of course, the animals that we're focusing on today are amphibians and reptiles, known collectively as herps. And they are two distinct classes of vertebrates that have very different characteristics from one another. And amphibians, most of them have a two-stage life cycle, an aquatic phase and a terrestrial phase. They have moist skin that's water permeable, and many species don't have any lungs, so the skin is actually their only breathing organ. It acts like a large respiratory surface, like the inside of a lung. And for their reproduction, they require a moist area to lay eggs and for the eggs to develop. On the other hand, on the left-hand or right-hand side of the slide here, reptiles don't have a two-stage life cycle. Usually when they hatch out of the egg, they resemble the adults and then grow accordingly. Their skin is dry and impermeable, and that allows them to exploit many different habitat types that amphibians can't. And reproductive-wise, they aren't tied to moist areas the way that amphibians are. Reptiles lay a cleidoic egg that allows for gas exchange and very limited water exchange. And again, that helps them to exploit a number of different habitat types. Next slide, please. So, of course, amphibians and reptiles, different species have different natural history characteristics, and it's going to vary greatly between different species. And if you're managing for, say, a frog or different species of frogs, you have to take into consideration the natural history characteristics of the individual species. But there are 5 major factors that you should consider when catering to the management and preservation of amphibians and reptiles, and at least keep them in the back of your mind when you're addressing different management questions. Next slide. The first thing, unlike birds and mammals, reptiles and amphibians are ectothermic. Birds and mammals have a high internal metabolism, and it generates body heat that they have to maintain in order to keep their body processes going. Amphibians and reptiles have a very slow metabolism, and they have to rely upon the temperature of the external environment in order to get their body temperature up to a range where they can feed and mate, etc. And so they're termed ectothermic or cold-blooded. So being ectothermic has its advantages, because during periods of drought or cold or excessive heat, reptiles and amphibians can essentially shut down and reduce their energy load and just wait these periods out. Next slide, please. And another aspect of herps is that you don't really see them out and about very much. They're mostly hidden and solitary. Amphibians, it's really understandable because they are tied to moister environments. So you find them underwater in ponds and aquatic environments, under rocks, maybe in caves. And but when they do venture forth, it's usually after rainstorms at night when the air is moist and there's a lot of water on the ground, and they can actually be quite conspicuous on roads if you go driving around at night to look for them. Reptiles, even though they are solitary and they tend to venture forth during the day, but many species are cryptic and can disappear against a background. And most snakes and lizards are that way. Some of the diurnal lizards actually are conspicuous. You can see them sitting on the tops of rocks if you go looking for them. And usually during the breeding season, amphibians will collect in large groups around ponds to breed. And for many snake species, they'll gather at hibernacula before they go down for winter estivation or hibernation, and they can be found in large numbers then. Next slide, please. And reptiles and amphibians use a variety of habitats, both aquatic and terrestrial, throughout their lives. Amphibians, of course, use aquatic habitat when they're larval, and then move on to the terrestrial habitats as adults. And even within a few days, they can use various different habitats. Royal toads, which are an endangered species here in Southern California, generally burrow and spend the diurnal hours burrowed into the sand along streams. And when they breed, they're usually found along streams too. But in the evenings, when they go out to forage, they can venture far away from the streams, sometimes up to a quarter mile away from the nearest water source to forage. And then they return to the streams to estivate or to burrow under the ground again. Snakes, especially during the breeding season, male snakes will cruise around looking for females and pass through many different habitat types during that time. Next slide, please. And both amphibians and reptiles have widely fluctuating populations that tend to change according to climatic conditions. Now, most herps are secondary consumers, and they rely on insects and rodent prey. And then the insects and the rodent prey, of course, many of them are primary consumers and rely on primary productivity. And during very wet years, you get a lot of plant growth. Rodents and insects feed on these. They reproduce, produce a lot of offspring, and then the herps feed on these prey, and then the herp populations increase. And this is data that was collected by our very own Larry Jones that just shows you the correlation between the moisture and the population size of reptiles. I think these are lizards in the southeastern United States. And another thing about herps in general is that, like many other species, they tend to have a metapopulation structure, so that even though a population may go extinct in one area, migration or emigration from other areas can replenish a population. So you may have local populations rising and crashing, but throughout the whole metapopulation structure, the numbers may stay relatively stable over time. Next slide, please. And really important that amphibians and reptiles are part of a functioning ecosystem. They serve as prey and serve as predators, and important in the flow of energy from lower trophic levels up to higher trophic levels. And for humans, herps play or provide certain ecosystem services, such as biological control, rodent control, insect control, seed dispersal in some cases, and cultural. Many Native American tribes utilize the cultural aspects of herps in religious ceremonies. Okay. And also crocodiles and alligators and some of the larger species can actually be keystone species and help to create a diverse and functioning ecosystem. Next slide, please. And with
thanks,
that,
Larry.
I'll turn it over to Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Larry and Ken. So that gets us to kind of the meat of the matter as far as what is the content, what's in the Southwest HMG. As Larry mentioned, there were some challenges because of the size and the diversity of habitats within a region as big as the Southwest. And so we do have a lot of color photos. We labored hard to make sure that it was loaded with good photo content to help display what is found in the Southwest and those habitats and herps, conservation challenges. There are both general and habitat specific recommendations for management. And just like the other HMGs on that point, I want to reinforce that these were written in a manner both to manage for biodiversity exclusively and to manage for other land uses. So where you have to juggle herps and the biodiversity with other potentially conflicting land uses. So the HMG realizes that everyone's not out there trying to maximize herps on their landscape. And so it's written in a way that you can find something applicable to your land area and the way that you manage it. There's also a lot of sidebars and unique stories that we put in, success stories, safety, adaptive management, et cetera. And then the appendices, priority species, the management planning, and other helpful resources load up the back end of the document. Next slide. These measures, guidelines in the HMG are all there to promote conservation of amphibians and reptiles. We want a mantra for park has always kind of been keeping common species common. Today's common species could be very much imperiled tomorrow, depending on situations and things that change in the environment. We want to stem the decline of already imperiled species, guide restoration of habitats while benefiting other species. We don't want to conflict with management for other taxa and other species with what's contained in the HMG. and also reducing the likelihood that additional species will be added to the endangered species list at both state, federal, or other levels. The southwestern United States shares conservation challenges with a lot of other places in the world, and certainly in the United States. This is a long list. We worked hard to compile, borrowing from the other HMGs, and those that are highlighted are those that have, I would say, extra or specific application to the Southwest. It's some of the last areas to be developed in the United States in the Southwest, and so habitat conversion is a big one, as well as surface and groundwater use. It's a generally arid region. The southwestern United States is a water-starved environment, if you will, dependent on rainfall and with fierce battles on water allocation. And so that translates very much to impacts to amphibians and reptiles. In some situations, livestock grazing is emblematic in the Southwest. You know, the cowboy and the rancher with their livestock, from cartoons as kids to the very modern world, is an important industry. And so that needs to be balanced, as well as mining oil and gas. Border security has gotten a lot of headlines recently, and we share a border with Mexico, our partner nation to the south, where border security is an issue, and non-native and invasive species, disease, climate change, and energy development, as Larry mentioned in that slide, where large-scale industrial alternative energy uses are taking up vast amounts of acreage in what would others might term, desert wasteland. Next slide. There were a number of habitats, we've said it a few times now, in the Southwest, and those in bold, we have some examples here in this webinar, but all of those listed are included in the HMG. I will say it again that we wrestled a long time to come up with a list of habitats because there are so many in the Southwest to keep it lean enough, but also inclusive of all the diversity of habitats. And so we hope that we've captured that for you. And for the end user, desert scrublands, grasslands, coastal sage scrub, chaparral, thorn scrub, juniper, and pinyon juniper, we have some examples. And then all those in red can kind of be lumped on the right under one term as freshwater related habitats. Next slide. One of the first habitat examples here, or the first, is desert scrublands. And we included this because the Southwest is, as I mentioned, the rancher and their cattle. Likewise, open desert is sort of emblematic of the southwestern United States. And so it is endemic to the southwestern U.S. There are 4 different deserts in North America, all of which occur in the United States in the Southwest. They have vast land areas, are biologically diverse, despite their harsh climate and the habitat. I've heard it said everything sticks, stings, or stinks in the deserts of the Southwest, where it is a fairly harsh environment in that sense, but it's very sensitive to perturbation or disturbance. And so there are also numerous threats with expanding population centers like Las Vegas and Los Angeles and these vast areas in Phoenix that take up a lot of desert area, and there are a lot of humans there. So there are a lot of threats that need to be balanced with land use. As far as priority species, there are a few amphibians and 12 reptiles that we would call it priority species after going through the exercise of defining them within park. And there are a number of conservation challenges as well. I mentioned water and development and alternative energy already, and habitat conversion. Next slide, Ken.
Thanks, Rob. And our next habitat are grasslands, and they're found in the southwestern United States, Southwest Park region, but of course they're not exclusively found in this region. And the term grassland is really sort of a catch-all term for a range of habitats that feature grasses as the dominant vegetation type. But even though they look the same, they're climatically, structurally, and compositionally very diverse. And I like to think of grasslands as sort of being a matrix habitat, because if you have these large grasslands, you can have other habitats sort of embedded or found within the grasslands, like permanent and ephemeral ponds, springs, seeps, woodlands can all be found within this matrix of grasslands. And they're very sensitive, especially to fire and poor management, which can cause habitat conversion, allow the influx of invasive species. Grazing can greatly reduce diversity, both of the grasses and of the herbs found within. And agriculture is impinging upon grasslands and pushing out the remaining native grasslands that are found in the Southwest region. And as Park has identified 5 amphibian and 7 reptile priority species for grasslands. Next slide, please. And our next habitat is one that's near and dear to Rob and mine's heart. And these are coastal sage scrub and chaparral habitats. And these are very endemic to the Southwest. Coastal sage scrub is found exclusively in California in the Mediterranean biome. And chaparral is found, of course, in California and in Arizona, and also spreads a little bit into western New Mexico. And they are shrub-dominated habitats, and they require periodic fires to keep the habitat healthy. Usually a fire return interval of anywhere between 30 to 150 years. 30 years for coastal sage scrub, 150 years or less for chaparral. And these habitats are very endangered, especially coastal sage scrub. They're disappearing due to development and due to fire. Development, of course, removes the habitats completely. Fire destroys them, and due to atmospheric nitrogen in California, it allows native grasses or non-native grasses to come in after the fire and totally supplant habitat that was once coastal sage scrub. And management challenges include water loss, drought, development, fire, habitat conversion, and the influx of invasive species. Next slide. I think this is Larry.
Yes, mine. So this one's a little different. This habitat example is juniper and pinyon juniper. These are huge areas, just like the deserts. There's huge areas of juniper and PJ. And it's actually a native ecosystem, but it's often treated as an invasive, because what Pinyon juniper can do is spread into other areas. So it's kind of an ecotonal thing. So for example, it can spread in the grasslands. Grasslands are used for cattle grazing, and so you have an issue there. So it's kind of a balancing act. It's also a different type of example, because PJ and juniper typically has few species of reptiles and amphibians, few that are actually characteristic. And as Rob mentioned, Park has a mantra, keeping common species common. So this is one of the examples of that. So something like this gopher snake is an animal you might find in here, as well as, say, fence lizards. It is a fire-adapted ecosystem. There's often grazing, vegetation restoration, and as I said, it's kind of a balance between when it's expanding in the places it doesn't belong versus are we getting rid of it in places where it does belong. So people need to spend some attention looking at that. And also because of the large acreages it covers, it involves multiple stakeholders. So once you get across, multiple lines of stakeholders, everybody's got to work together. So that's where partners come in for amphibian and reptile conservation. Next.
Our next habitat is actually something that Rob mentioned in an earlier slide, water-related habitats. And again, this is a catch-all category that includes everything: ephemeral pools, permanent ponds, cattle tanks, lakes, streams, rivers, cienagas, etc. And just because of the large variety of different types of habitats included within water-related habitats, there are a large number of species included, both common and sensitive. In the Southwest, of course, water is a limiting resource, and in times of drought, these habitats can shrink, and this is from both natural evaporation and the fact that the habitats aren't being replenished from rain, and also from human use, which can reduce the amount of water available. And the conservation challenges are many. Development, of course, can cause runoff, pesticides, herbicides, chemicals into freshwater habitats and degrade them. Fire management: when fires occur, runoff after the vegetation's been removed can cause siltation and damage freshwater habitats. Invasive species, bullfrogs, for example, while they're native to the East Coast or the Eastern United States, they are invasives out here, and if they get a toehold, they can wipe out native species found within in ponds and streams. Next slide.
So the last example, this is Thorn Scrub, and Thorn Scrub in its pure form is only found in South Texas, and it's a transition from desert to tropical rainforest. So that's kind of what it is. It's another habitat endemic to the Southwest. There's also some animals that are thorn scrub associates that are found in southern Arizona, because thorn scrub is found not too far from the border there. It's really a small area, and it's perhaps the most threatened ecosystem in the United States. Well, at least in the Southwest region, I should say, though that's arguable, I guess. It is biologically rich, multiple species. The habitat is sensitive to environmental perturbation. And for one thing, there's a lot of people that live in South Texas, and so a lot of the habitat is already gone and has been turned into urban areas, and all the needs that go along with that. Again, in the Southwest, we have the only border with Mexico, and border security is an issue. And you've been following the news, there's more things going on with that than even when we put these slideshows together. So right now there are 2 species of amphibians and 5 species of reptiles. And it probably would have been higher, except we thought most of these species are probably okay because there are enough land set aside for them to persist. But one thing about the priority species list is it needs to be updated periodically. And so as things change, animals can be put on or taken off the list. And just a little side note, this is not to replace the Endangered Species Act or anything like that. These are just animals that within our region we believe are potentially threatened and in need of conservation. Next.
Thanks, Larry. So we wanted to showcase a couple examples or highlight a few examples of cases where we've been able to bring together partnerships, and park large, that's the first word in the organization, is partners. And so here we wanted to provide some examples of how we were able to partner in an HMG type fashion. One of those is the flat-tailed horn lizard. For those who aren't aware, Death Valley is not the only place that's below sea level in California. This horn lizard occupies Southern California's Colorado Desert region in the Sonoran Desert, either at or below sea level in the Imperial and Coachella Valleys, and then going southward into northern Sonora, Mexico, in Baja and Sonora. And 20 years ago, a lot of folks, government agency folks, got together to try and put together something real meaning something that we're going to do on the ground for the species to keep it in perpetuity. And again, this year we've celebrated 20 years of voluntary conservation for the flat-tailed horned lizard. Next slide. So how do you go about that? First, you got to figure out your partners, right? And they can all come on board later, whatever. But these state and federal partners in Southern California, Arizona, and in northern Mexico, binational, mind you, got together 20 years ago because they saw that there was a problem with this species, and that if they didn't put in some protections and monitor the species, it could get listed as endangered for very good reason. The numbers could decline, and that could also jam up their land use, from things as diverse as the Marine Corps and Navy doing testing and training, to Ocotillo Wells recreational vehicle area, being able to allow people to recreate in California, and Zabrego Desert State Park, to allow people to recreate in a state park, Bureau of Reclamation with their water management. All these diverse groups got together 20 years ago and formed a coalition for the flat-tailed horned lizard. They are called the Flat-tailed Horned Lizard ICC, Interagency Coordinating Committee. And the idea, again, is to protect the species in perpetuity, allowing for their land use by managing for that species. Next slide. So one of the first steps, and these steps can be juggled with your specific circumstances, but first you want to define what's important to the species. And this is a fairly busy slide, but if you home in on the really dense areas with the most dots, that is densely or darkened areas, those are about the only undeveloped areas in the United States there pictured. And so those areas were carved out and defined by stakeholder, and you can see the blue and red dots kind of at the top left. Bordered by the blue is the Salton Sea, and there's agriculture and development in the form of cities and neighborhoods in between these dark shaded blobs within the larger shaded area that is the range of the species. So these stakeholders define those management areas that are important to the species in perpetuity. If you want to grab what's left and what's available for the species, those are those areas. Next slide. So defining where the species is on your land or lands. Here's a cleaner figure showing those shaded areas that I was indicating. And then the acronyms are for the different management and research areas divvied up by landowner and stakeholder. Next slide. So now that you have those areas and you kind of have your head around where the species is on your land area or shared among land areas, you need to develop a management strategy. How do we manage this species? How do we watch it and take care of it in perpetuity and monitor it, and not just monitor it to a decline, to an extinction, which has happened for many species, and there's papers written about that. So developing a management strategy with real on the ground strategies for how to count it, how to watch it, how to reduce impacts to its habitat and to the species directly is really important. So there were two editions. This one pictured is the cover of the 2003 revision, which is the one we're using today. Next slide. There are 11 different federal and state offices involved among those multiple stakeholders I mentioned. And so the third step is to implement the management strategy. Take what you've written in that document that you've deemed as important to the species and put it on the ground. Analyze your data, maintain your data, make sure that you're getting quality results, that you're responsible, and that people are truly doing what they're, the landowners are called to do within the terms of the management strategy. And this graph just shows some of the trends in time for a particular management area from 2012, the detection probabilities. There are multiple land uses. The picture of the gentleman there, that's Rob Palmer, where we were blading a road to go out and do geothermal exploration on Navy land. And so that's a linear impact, and you need to mitigate that and understand that that could have some undue consequences for the flat-tailed horned lizard. And likewise, there's natural predation in the bottom right, where sidewinders and other species will predate the species. So you need to consider the predation, mitigate the threats, and definitely monitor the species, because without good data, you're not going to be able to form good management decisions. Next slide. And the most important thing, I started off with partnerships, is to maintain those partnerships with all your stakeholders. And so last year we had our first symposium after 20 years that was exclusive to the flat-tailed horned lizard, and it was a really diverse set of folks. But that right there in that picture, that is 20 years of success. Those are the people who have kept their hand on the rudder for that species and are continuing to manage it through time with turnover in staffing and funding, with all the problems. But as a partnership, you're able to weather those problems and changes better than by doing it solo. And so after 20 years, we've been through the federal courts a few times with this species to petition to list it, and it was never listed because we are truly managing it, and we have good numbers and good data to indicate that. Next slide.
So now we're going to flip-flop to a wetter area with wet herps. So this is the Chiricahua leopard frog. This is another example of using partnerships to try and recover species that are in not good shape. My example here is focusing mostly on southeastern Arizona in this mountain range, a small mountain range called the Pajarito Mountains. Next slide. So the problem is, as with the horned lizard, its populations are being extirpated, and the species as a whole is headed towards extinction. And this is a federally threatened species. The problem is that it's succumbing to a number of factors, such as chytridiomycosis, which is a deadly fungal infection that affects amphibians, especially frogs. Just a general lack of surface water, because water is being diverted. And then there's drought, climate change, and then invasive species, most notably the American bullfrog. Ken mentioned that. If you're in East Texas, it's native there, but out farther west, it causes big problems. And there, of course, there are many partners, as Rob alluded to, on any of these projects, and that's why we're partners in conservation. And so you can see the list there. Next slide, please. Okay, my little story here begins with the University of Arizona and Arizona Game and Fish Department. And they took on what seemed to be an immense task that probably a lot of people think, well, you can't even do that. What that is you'll never have recovery of a Chiricahua leopard frog population if you have bullfrogs present. And so, again, focusing on the Pajarito Mountains, these two groups went in, and actually at the University of Arizona, there was some graduate students who were really involved in this. And then Arizona Game and Fish, they have a department on frogs, actually, because we're losing a lot of native species. So they had to first get rid of the bullfrogs before we could get the Chiricahua leopard frogs back. And so nobody likes killing stuff. And, you know, these bullfrogs can't help that they were, you know, living here, and it's not their fault. But we had to get rid of them. And so the frogs were killed, but the good news is that they were actually taken to the Phoenix Zoo, where they're fed to crocodilians. And so they kind of help those animals out. And so they did, while it was to some the unmanageable, they actually got rid of dozens of populations of American bullfrogs. And they actually eradicated them from this whole area, except that to the east, there is a river system that it's hard for them they can always hide out in there. Next, please. At the time, I was working for the Coronado National Forest, and here's just some of the things that we did as our little part to help. For example, I was on the leopard frog recovery team, And you can see there's various things that we did. I won't go through the whole list, but it's one of these things where you think globally, act locally, and so everything we do to help bring this species back is useful. Next slide. And something I think we're really kind of proud of was this Rudy Ronquillo pond. And Pena Blanca spring is really just it was a broken spring box, and it fed to a cattle drinker. And there'd always be one or two leopard frogs there, sometimes lowland, sometimes Chiricahua leopard frogs. But as the bullfrog eradication was getting underway and Pena Blanca Lake was being eradicated of bullfrogs because it was a super site, we took advantage to improve habitat at this spring. And so they rebuilt a pond and had a wetland that creeped out of there. And now if you go to this site, there are dozens or maybe hundreds of Chiricahua leopard frogs every time. So it's a huge success story. And there are also a number of other species of amphibians and countless species of butterflies. It's just incredible what this place has become. And so this is just a little pond with bentonite that was put in, but it made a huge difference. And it's now supplying a source of Chiricahua leopard frogs to go elsewhere in the pond regions. Next slide, please. And so again, that was just one piece of the conservation efforts for the Chiricahua leopard frog. I mean, you think about all the agencies that did their parts and the Forest Service that did their parts on different plots of land, and how people have actually worked towards other species in similar habitats, such as lowland leopard frogs, Tarahumara frogs, which incidentally were the first frog that went extinct in the United States, and are trying to bring it back. There are also native tiger salamanders and narrow-headed garter snakes and Mexican garter snakes. So all of the efforts to help all of these aquatic animals from this general area of southern Arizona just means more success across the board. Next slide.
Okay, suppose you want to implement or conserve reptiles and amphibians. What do you do? How do you get started? Well, suppose you want to, for example, mitigate for a solar farm or improve habitat for a particular species. In this case, we have here the formerly endangered American alligator. Next slide. Well, the first thing you want to do is get a hold of one of the HMGs for your particular region. And within each HMG, there are two sets of recommendation for each habitat within the particular document. And depending on what your goals are, you may choose the ideal set of recommendations. And those are for land managers who are focusing specifically on amphibian reptiles, as the amphibian reptile conservation is their primary goal. So referring to the previous slide, this would be the example using the alligator. Compatible recommendations are for land managers who wish to contribute to the conservation of amphibians and reptiles while managing for multiple uses. So that would be the example using the solar farm. Next slide, please. So if you read the HMG for your region and identify the specific habitats that are within your sphere of influence, so forest, grassland, ecotone, grassland, and then wetland, and then identify the specific conservation challenges that are represented within these habitats: timber harvest, roads, grazing, and invasive grasses. Next slide, please. Then go to Appendix B in the Southwest HMG, and there are guidelines in there for developing a specific management plan. And in the next couple slides, we're going to go over some of the higher points within that Appendix B. Next slide. So what's really important before you get started is to familiarize yourself with federal, state, and local regulations and policies regarding herps and their habitats, what permits are required, what you can and can't do in specific habitats. And of course, Park has put out a document that has the an overview of the legal legal documents for each state in the union. Next slide, please. So what's really important is that before you begin any management plan is know what you have. And this is identifying potential amphibian reptile habitats, identifying the location of the habitats using spatial information, VegMap GIS to drop a VegMap and identify the exact locations, identify the species or that are known or suspected to occur in each habitat type, and identify the management objectives for each habitat. Now, you can do this on paper or do it on the ground. Of course, doing it on the ground is a lot more fun. And I guess that would depend upon what budgetary constraints you also have. So it's very important to inventory what you've got before you move forward. Next slide, please. And when implementing a management plan, consider possibly addressing multiple species, consider various mitigation options for any impacts that may be incurred, consider direct and indirect effects that your management efforts may have on other species. And it's really important to stay the course because the results from any management plan may not bear fruit for a year, maybe 2 years out. Next slide, please. And of course, no management plan is perfect from the get-go. And it's really important to monitor the aspects of the management plan as you move forward and evaluate different parts of it. And if things aren't working out the way they should, simply modify the plan and change it so that it continues to move forward and hopefully meet specific management goals that you have. Next slide.
Ken, I just wanted to mention that with adaptive management, please consider that even within the HMGs, this journey started about 10 years ago to develop the Southwest HMG, and the other HMGs were being produced at that time and or had been. And so to note, at least one of those HMGs has been revised during the period that Park has been putting them together because conditions change. And so with adaptive management, expect change as the norm and plan for the future. And also the resources at the end of the HMG, we tried to make develop them as much as we could for the end user so that you've got a wealth of information to refer to. And if not, then reach out to your local university, natural history museum, or other biological collaborators and other agencies, and I'm sure they would be happy to help you. Next slide.
Okay, we'll open it up for questions at this time. I don't see any typed in the questions box, but I actually I have one for Larry. When Larry was talking about the bullfrog example where they had to eradicate them for the Chiricahua leopard frogs, there's a lot of, I know, national park units that are dealing with bullfrog eradication and management. And so I was wondering, Larry, if you had any specific recommendations as to what you found to be most effective for managing bullfrogs?
I would say the people that did this, was not me really, but a lot of the partners that did this kind of came from all different angles. They did whatever it took for a specific situation. So for example, in Sycamore Creek, which was a natural ecosystem in which 3 species of native red-headed frogs had essentially gone extinct, it was overrun with bullfrogs, and they used large nets like they use for commercial fishing, and actually went into some of the pools and got rid of as many as they possibly could. And then they had to do other things. So the bullfrogs are primarily nocturnal. And so they needed to go back to sites, and they were permitted and the like to use guns, and then they would also gig the frogs. And it was particularly important for them to identify adult breeders. So none of them are allowed to be there, but an adult breeder was really bad news because of the progeny it could do. And then another thing that's been done is, for example, electrofishing in some standing water areas. And so some of these areas that are really complex, it takes a lot of effort. That's part one. Part two is that you need to maintain the situation. So in this area, the Chiricahua leopard frog and lowland leopard frogs both occur there. Populations exploded, and they were like almost, few and far between, and then they were like all over again. So it was great, but that will reverse itself if they're allowed to go back to the way it was. So that source pool I mentioned that was along the river has to be watched, and so these agencies need to go out every year and make sure no breeding adults are getting into the population. So it's just kind of whatever works for that situation, I guess, is the answer.
Okay, thanks, Larry. Great answer. And so we also had a question. I'll give this one to Rob. How do folks get the habitat management guidelines?
Yeah, so they're still available for purchase. Help me out on that, Jen. Online at the Park Place website that Jen mentioned at the beginning. Park usually sets up a booth at the major HERP meetings within different regions, and I expect there will be some available there. And also, it will be available as a PDF eventually. Don't mean to wah on Park for the profits, but we need to sell out the remaining hard copies. And then I think, like some of the other HMGs, will be available as a PDF at the parkplace.org website. Sorry, sure. I don't have a bunch of copies extra, so don't email me and ask.
And they're also available online at Amazon.com. If you just type in the name of the publication, it's I believe it's $15 plus shipping and handling. But that question actually came from somebody within the National Park Service. So if you work for the National Park Service, please email me because the Park Service bought a supply for Park Service employees. And so I have some here in my office that I can mail you a hard copy.
Yeah, Jen, also, real quick, I'll add the DOD had also bought some copies, but then we exhausted those. So if you're with DOD, sorry, we've already given those all out, like the Park Service. A lot of agencies contributed, like Larry mentioned, for Forest Service. So props to everyone who did.
Okay, and somebody had commented in the questions box that it's already available through PDF, and that's actually not the case. We're maintaining the copy of the PDF until, again, as Rob had mentioned, that we're, we've kind of exhausted sales and aren't getting any, after a considerable amount of time. Okay, so this question is for the group. What can early career herpetologists, such as those who are in graduate school, who are interested in academic careers, do to help managers with our research? Any general advice?
Wow, yeah, there's a lot of things that you can do. And
they said another way of putting this is, how can an academic research best inform management?
I would always encourage students to make sure they get their results published. That way it gets out there into the peer-reviewed literature so that herpetologists can find it. But Ken, you're a reserve manager. Larry and I both have experience, but your experience would be really vital to this. How do you get that intel?
Well, we don't really have, I can't really give a perspective from herps, but for small mammals, we interact regularly with the agency people, Forest Service, Cal Fish and Game, Fish and Wildlife Service, and university people that do research. So there's an exchange at these meetings. So I guess one way to interact with management people would be to approach people that are in the agencies that may be doing that may be managing for particular species. And if you're studying that particular species or multiple species, speak with them, because you may have information that would be vital to their management. Because that's one of the main problems, is that there's not really a lot of cross-pollination between the agencies and academia, unless the agencies actually fund an academic research. Otherwise, if you have particular information that was funded by NSF that would be applicable to a management situation, it may never make it into the management arena. So I think it would be behoove you to be proactive in that regard.
I would like
we
to
were one
add
students too.
that,
Sorry, Larry, just to add real quick, we will want students too. Don't be bashful about talking to us, because when you've got good data on a species, reach out to those folks that have that species on their land. Larry, sorry.
That's okay. I was just going to point out, and kind of an aside to this question, but academia is not the only outlet for research.
Yep.
Because the three of us are actually, well, Rob and I are both public land management agency people. I came from the research branch of the Forest Service. And the thing about when you go to these park meetings, you'll see a little bit of everybody. So you have some of the academia, some people do research, some don't, some do management. And Ken mentioned it's good to cross-pollinate, and sometimes that's difficult. But I would say by attending a park meeting, especially a Southwest Park meeting, you're there to cross-pollinate. You're there to network with everyone else from all these different groups.
Okay, so we have some more comments and questions rolling in. I think that this comment is helping to answer the question about how academia can work with management. But one of the webinar participants said that the Forest Service could always use inventory and surveys along with population estimates. So maybe contact your local Forest Service office. Another question that came in, and we have several to get through. It says, if you cannot remove all bullfrogs from a possible leopard frog site, is it still useful to try to remove just breeding adults? That question's probably for Larry.
Well, I'm more of a reptile guy, but I'll try and defend this. I would say yes. I would say yes, it's worth to try to manage it as best you can. There's a couple of reasons I say that is I think all the efforts help, number one. But I also think that the chytridiomycosis, the animals may hopefully become adapted to this over time. So this is a new disease that was thrust upon these animals that had no resistance to it whatsoever. And so if you can keep the bullfrogs down, and I forgot to mention that bullfrogs can be a source of chytridiomycosis. They have it, they can have it, but they don't actually catch it themselves and die of it, like most of the native random frogs do. So I think it's always worth that extra effort just in case the population can adapt. There are also some areas where you can have, some areas where you can have bullfrogs as well as native random frogs coexisting. And those types of places are usually complex habitats. So I mentioned there's like rivers with oxbows and wetlands. So there's like shallow areas or maybe deep pools. So you might have bullfrogs in the pools, and in the overflow of the oxbows at the wetlands, you might have the leopard frogs holding on. So I guess I'm one to think that whatever you can do helps and doesn't hurt. And then when you're doing that, you should also be documenting what's happening, and so we can learn from it. And even if it is nothing done under scientific rigor, at least you can share information with others about what seems to be happening. But that's kind of the same basis for adaptive management. See what works and see what doesn't.
Hey, Larry, for a non-reptile guy, didn't you write Amphibians of the Pacific Northwest, the book?
Yeah, that was up there. There's all wet hoops up there down here. I'm in the land of dry hoops now.
Right on.
Okay, so we have another question here. It says, what are the most important management principles to consider when trying to conserve habitat for endemic plethodonids? And the example they gave was like the Jemez mountain salamander. Can anybody take that one?
Just add water.
Okay, could you repeat the question?
Sure.
And I'll try to send it. So.
What are the most important management principles to consider when trying to conserve habitat for endemic plethodonids?
Okay, so I actually worked on plethodonids in the Pacific Northwest, so that was a little different. That's in an area where it's perpetually wet. And so plethodonid salamanders, they are amphibians, but they get their moisture through the environment, which usually means moist to wet substrates. And so when it comes down to survivability of plethodonid salamanders, especially these, these truly terrestrial ones like we have in the West, then it's all about conserving the moisture in the microhabitats. And so, for example, some concepts here are, if you had to, say, thin an area, say, thin a forest around where there's a population of plethodonid salamanders, the closer you get to the salamander, the more surface area have of xerification, where it dries out, and you're thereby affecting the animal. So if you want to maintain a population of something that has such strict water needs, you'd probably want to have a much larger buffer. So you need to do that. And then also the other thing about plethodonid salamanders, and some are rock dwellers, some are wood dwellers, but what they normally like is complex structural features, such as big logs and then deep talus slopes, things like that. So I think it all comes down to microhabitat, but you need to maintain the character of the microhabitat.
Hey, Larry, I'd also add, I'm kind of tiptoeing on the wire here. Don't be naive that a lot of the springs and seeps that have plethodonids in the arid Southwest, you're looking at multi-species management where they could be guzzlers or places that are used as natural springs and seeps where horses and burros and bighorn sheep and deer are also using that habitat. And there could very well be a management action in place for other species like the larger hoofed mammals. So there are numerous examples where sites have been compromised by the same.
Right.
And so make sure that you integrate with your.
That does bring up the point that a plethodonid salamander is not a plethodonid salamander, it's a plethodonid salamander, because there are some that live in seeps and some that are completely terrestrial. And so when I heard the reference to New Mexico, I was thinking of those are basically forest dwellers that are completely upland, that are found in an arid area, which is very different than East Texas, which is very different than the Northwest. So again, it's knowing the animal's life history, and as Rob was saying, these other animals that may be there as well. There's a lot to juggle. I admit there's a lot to juggle, and you just do the best you can.
Okay, thank you. And I will contact the person who asked this question after the webinar, but I thought maybe off the top of your head, you guys might know some other individuals as well, but they want to know if there are any contacts or agencies in Colorado who are actively controlling bullfrogs. I know some folks in Colorado Park that I can get this person connected up with, but do you guys know of anybody off the top of your head?
Just Colorado Park, that was one of the pins on the map where there's a state chapter of park is Colorado. So Jen, if you don't mind, if you're going to follow up with them, shoot them maybe their current chairperson or whatever.
Okay, sounds good. Then the next question is, are feral and domestic cats a problem anywhere within the Southwest? If so, how are they being dealt with given the strong advocacy for them?
That's a tough question.
Yeah, I don't want to dominate the questions, but I will say coastal California. Since I work for the military in my paying job, there are a number of Navy installations that have that issue. And just as the question was posed, there's a lot of love out there for cats, independent of what they may be doing to threatened or endangered species directly. And only through involving everyone and getting to a spay, neuter, release, or capture and remove effort. It takes a consortium of people and a lot of effort, besides the signage, the enforcement, maybe if people are dumping food and things like that, that you have existing regulations to control. You need to work it in a really diverse way to start to get those numbers down. The Channel Islands, California, is probably the best example where that land went to National Park Service and or military, where they got them out of there. They were not compatible with the land use, but that took decades, and those cats are not easy to remove.
Yeah, the main problem with cats that I'm familiar with is in urban areas, and not so much with herps, but they take out a lot of songbirds. And once you get away from the urban areas, you know, more coyotes, because they keep tabs on the cats, you know, sort of a biological control for cats.
Yeah. I might point out that in the HMG is Appendix C, which is non-native invasive species of concern for amphibians and reptiles. It doesn't answer the question. Around Tucson here, cats last about 20 minutes before they're eaten by coyotes, so it's not an issue here. But right, the Channel Islands is a really good example. And there are all kinds of things like feral hogs in Texas, for example, and parts of California. It's something to be reckoned with.
Yeah. Outside of wet places, you know, like I said, coastal California, like Larry said, put them near coyotes and they don't last long at all. I don't mean to laugh, but it's just a natural cycle.
Okay, and I think that this might be the last question, unless another one pops in while I'm reading this, but do you have specific guidance for northern leopard frog conservation and recovery, specifically for the Front Range of Colorado? So again, that's specific guidance for northern leopard frog conservation and recovery.
Well, I'll take the first part of this. Number one, contact Colorado Park, as previously mentioned. But I think there are many, many resources on leopard frog management. And there's the leopard frog recovery plan. And there's many agencies that are involved. So, in 2 minutes, I can't say specifically what to do. But I would say there's a wealth of information out there that's useful and can be put to good use. And there are many people who can be contacted who have expertise in that field. So I think this is like the desert tortoises, where a lot of money has been spent trying to manage for those things. And so there are a lot of resources available from the research and the previous management plans that have been used.
And this is kind of a shout out, but email Erin Muths, ERIN.MUTHS@USGS.gov. And she's been working with toads predominantly in the Front Range there for a long time. And Erin's a great gal and a good supporter of Southwest Park, but she falls right in there. Jen's right there in your backyard. So there's a lot of really good allies for that question in Colorado in general, besides just hitting up the Colorado Park branch of Park, if you will, state chapter.
Okay. And we have another question that came in. What do you feel is the best way to balance the desire to increase community support and involvement for herp conservation and the threat of poaching? Again, how do you get community support and involvement for herp conservation, but then balance that with, people then going out there and illegally collecting?
Wow.
Okay, I'll take a stab at this. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I always think about things that Again, I don't want this to come across the wrong way, but if we know better, then it's our job to teach others, or if we know of a better alternative. And so you really have to become engaged and be proactive on things. If you're concerned that people are doing bad things in the form of poaching or getting them energized with herps, it's a matter of teaching. There's kind of a mantle of responsibility there to get the word out and show people why we like herps and the cool things that they may not understand about herps. But you can't diss on other people for not doing it. It's a matter of educating them and bringing them up. And that's the big emphasis of Park at large, is to get partnerships where people are energized and educated about the benefits of herps.
And I'll give you a couple good examples. One, I'm working with the Tucson Herpetological Society, and this is not a group, you know, that likes to hold giant snakes and show what different color morphs they have. This is a group that's conservation oriented, education oriented, and we're doing a lot of outreach and coming up with ideas how to reach out to the public. And in fact, we already do some of that, but we're looking to do even more of that over time.
And I was also thinking too that maybe you could use common species or things like that, you know, like not take the public to locations of rare species or anything like that. But even with common species, you have that thread of somebody going in and collecting, you know, hundreds of a common species frog, I guess, after you would show them a site. But again, I guess it goes back to what Rob said about being the one who teaches them better. And with that, I guess we don't have any more. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, I just want to add one thing. Another thing in the HMG is we talk about success stories and some of these sidebars. And one of the success stories is about these rattlesnake roundups. And so, I mean, I live in Arizona where poaching is a big deal, but there's also a lot of people who are not really into the whole collect and kill thing. We don't have legal collection here. But in Texas, we talk about one of the rattlesnake roundups that became a nature festival. And so no animals are killed at all. In fact, where they used to cut their heads off and stand amongst a bunch of snakes and people invariably get snake bitten, that's completely gone. And what it is, it's an education thing, and it's just as popular as ever.
Okay. Well, we don't have any more questions. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and especially Larry, Ken, and Rob for taking the time to share their expertise on amphibian and reptile conservation and management. And with that, we will end the webinar. And again, this will be available as a recording if you want to go back to it later on parkplace.org. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Thanks, Jen.